Okay, hello and welcome to our talk entitled, I'm sitting here trying to understand this variable. So as the name implies, this is a talk about a rather curious variable that's quite common in England, yet is maybe unfamiliar to North American speakers or speakers outside of the UK. And that is this variation or the alternation between the present and past participle forms of the verbs sit and stand with progressive meanings, or illustrated in the examples here, where for many speakers outside the UK, the sat form is quite marked. So I think, speaking as a North American English speaker myself, I would much prefer to say I'm sitting on the bus next to him rather than I'm sat on the bus. So this variable, the BSAT variant in particular, is well known among dialectologists. It's cited as very common even amongst well-spoken people, but not accepted as correct in standard English. Here, Wood, writing back in 1962, so this has been around for a while. We know that it's mainly found in informal speech and writing. It's often remarked upon and prescribed by style guides or prescriptive grammarians as being incorrect or wrong. But largely, it seems to be somewhat under the radar for most average British English speakers. So it's not something that people comment on or talk about as being a noted regional feature distinctive to any particular area. As far as the history and the distribution goes, we know, at least from data as early as the 1950s, that it was likely concentrated traditionally in the north of England and possibly in the southwest, or it quickly spread to the southwest after developing in the north. But presently it seems to be well established through much of England, and sort of a characteristic of a typical informal language or informal speech across England as a whole. Outside of England and Wales, it's quite rare, however, and that includes Scotland and Ireland. As far as the origins of this variant go, it's not entirely clear. There are two competing hypotheses for where this variant might have come from, and we'll explore both of those in this talk. I think there are compelling reasons to suggest that it's actually a recent innovation rather than an older one. So as far as the existing research goes, it's quite good. However, it's largely based on very small samples of data. And so that means that the regional patterns and the regional picture that we have are still a bit murky. So one of the goals is to understand that a bit better in this talk. There's also very little direct historical evidence for either of the origin hypotheses we just considered, so we're left trying to sort of reconstruct possible historical explanations based largely on some of the distributional patterns that we find. And finally, it's still not entirely clear what external or internal factors, if any, correlate with the variation between sit and sitting, stand and standing. So one of the aims of this study is to sort of bring to bear some of the more modern techniques and data sources that we have available to us to try to explore some of these open questions, in particular looking at data from Twitter and other billion-word corpora, to ask to what extent or what is the contemporary geographical distribution of this variant in the UK and beyond, and to what extent can that maybe tell us something a bit about when and where this variant is most likely to have originated and why it originated in that place at that time. The primary data sources that we're going to be using for the distributional picture come from a few very, very large corpora, including the Twitter dialect corpus, Global Corpus of Web-Based English, Bank of English, and the Spoken BNC. These are quite large corpora, in some cases involving 2 million words or close to 2 million words from hundreds of millions of texts, websites, involving a number of different countries. All of this is informal language, with the exception of Bank of English, perhaps, where we expect to find good examples of this variant. So to extract the data, we used some very simple regex, regular expression, and CQP web searches for online corpora, basically looking for any form of the verb be followed by sat, sitting, standing, or stood. After we extracted our initial data set, we randomly sampled tokens from each corpus and manually checked them for false positives. We verified that these were indeed instances of the kind we were looking for, mainly excluding things like passives of transitive uses of sat and stood. And we found that the false positive rates for even this very simple search were quite low, so well below 5%, meaning roughly 95% or more of our data were actual genuine examples of the kind we're interested in. So just here's a quick picture of our data sets. Our largest data set comes from the Twitter corpus, their smallest from the spoken BNC. Again, not surprising given the sizes of these corpora overall. But we just want to point out that from the Twitter data in particular is massive. We have well over 100,000 tokens, probably the largest data set compiled for any sort of single variable that we're aware of. So we have a really, really big, we think really good and reliable data set for analyzing this variable. And just again, for further reassurance, just for illustration of the kinds of data we're looking at in Twitter, we have no reason to think that this is skewed or distorted in any way, systematically at least. We can find lots and lots of examples of exactly the kind of tokens that we're looking for. And these are just some further examples of what we find in the Twitter data. So these are really easy to find and really dependable. So turning to the Twitter data results, we find really strong regional signals. We find that, in particular, the highest proportion of BSAT, very high, in the 90% or more, found in the north and to a very slightly lesser extent in the southwest. Right? We find that BSAT is relatively less frequent than that in the Midlands, around Birmingham and Leicester, and in the area around London and the southeast. And we find that it's virtually absent in Scotland and Northern Ireland, which is really interesting. If we look at the picture for stood versus standing, we find that it's practically identical. The maps barely change. In fact, we may not even notice that I switched. So again, we find a strong signal in the southwest around Bristol and areas down there, and in the north, in Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, Liverpool, Yorkshire area. We find a weaker signal in the Midlands and in the southeast, and again, general absence of this feature in variant in the parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. So putting this all together, the Twitter data largely confirms what prior research has said, that this form, BSAT, comes mainly, or is concentrated at least mainly in the north. It's also concentrated in the southwest, and this is some bit of a novel finding on our part, but it's much less so in the Midlands and especially in the southeast around London and the home counties. And finally, we just want to say that we think that this is a very clear picture, and we know that based on other studies from comparing geolocated Twitter data with data from traditional dialect surveys, that they are very strongly correlated with one another. So we think that this is a very reliable picture of the sort of fine-grained distribution of BSAT in the UK. So this is really reliable. We have no reason to doubt that this is a strong signal here. Looking beyond the UK, we have the data from Globe, which contains data from 20 different English-speaking countries around the world. Again, we see an incontrovertible UK signal here. So we find that the UK data, in this case, is almost 3 times as frequent as in any other country from this corpus. These are informal web blogs, things like that. We find that the percentages are much higher in British English, and the simple raw frequencies are considerably higher than anywhere else. In fact, these numbers are probably overestimates from these other countries like the United States and so on. So again, we have a really strong evidence that this is predominantly a British English feature. Turning now to the Bank of English data, things get a bit more interesting. So here we have data from different registers. But again, we find that despite sort of overall smaller proportions of BSAT, there's a clear skew towards the UK. We don't find very many tokens at all in data from other countries, and we find most of the data from the UK in spoken registers. So again, it's confirming the informality of this feature, right? This is nothing that surprising, but something that hasn't been established before with good data. Looking at the sort of historical picture, so again, this data, this corpus contains data from the 1960s to the early 2000s, and we find something like an inkling of a change in progress, especially in the spoken data, which really takes off in the 90s. We also find that data in the magazines and newspapers sort of picks up a little bit as well. This is perhaps due to sampling bias in the corpus, where most of the data in the corpus comes from these more recent years anyway, so it's not perhaps surprising we find more data in these later years than in the earlier years. But nonetheless, we think that there's maybe a suggestion of a change in progress, despite the overall fairly low percentage of BSAT in this data set. Finally, we have the data from spoken BNC, which is a number of recorded conversations from speakers in different parts of England. We find, again, the largest proportions of BSAT are found in the north, northwest, Yorkshire, Liverpool. These areas are in the north of England, confirming our Twitter data. Our data set is much smaller here, so we have to be a bit cautious. We also have reason to believe that, based on this, that perhaps data from the south of England is underrepresented overall in this corpus. So we should be very cautious about how we interpret these geographical signals. Particularly note that the southwest shows a much smaller percentage in this data set than what we found in the Twitter corpus, where we think the data is more reliable. Nonetheless, we can also look at some of the social information that's available to us in the spoken BNC, and here we'll just focus on speaker sex, where we find a significant effect of sex for the verb sit. So we find that female speakers are significantly more likely to use BSAT than male speakers, which is a bit puzzling. We don't really have a good explanation for that, but it's something to follow up on nonetheless. And we find that this only really applies for the verb sit. The verb stand doesn't show any kind of gender or sex effect. Okay, so summarizing the distribution really quickly is we find that BSAT predominates as an informal variant in most of England, most notably in the southwest and especially the north. This prevalence in the southwest has previously only really been hinted at in prior research, and so this is a genuinely novel finding, we think, especially given the high proportion of its BSAT in the southwest. We do find that it is present basically everywhere else, but just much less frequent in areas in the Midlands and in the southeast. Again, we find minimal presence in Scotland or Ireland. We find minimal presence in the rest of the English-speaking world, suggesting that this is indeed something like an English feature, not just a UK feature, but a feature of England and Wales to a certain extent. So turning now to the historical origins, well, again, there are two competing accounts. There's one account that this is a much older vestige of a Germanic system that has been present for many, many centuries and has simply been carried down to the present day. Alternatively, there's an account that this is a much more recent innovation, beginning perhaps most likely in the north and spreading outward from there. And we'll look at these quickly for the rest of this talk. So the conservative B-perfect account basically argues that BSAT is a kind of remnant of a much older historical variation between the be and the have perfect systems, the use of be versus have as perfect auxiliaries. And this is something that's been discussed widely in the English linguistics literature. And we do find remnants of this form in a number of regional dialects and vernaculars in different places, particularly in Irish English and in Insular Scots and in parts of Canadian English and in the United States that were settled by speakers from Ireland and Scotland. And so here are just a few examples of the kinds of things that we're looking at. So when I'm finished the book, or I'm nearly finished this, or I'm done my homework, the classic Canadian English variable. And we do find some examples of this, but they're very few and far between that look at least ambiguous between a perfect or progressive readings. So you can compare here and consider substituting the progressive versus the standard progressive or standard perfect forms. And these, I think, either could be acceptable. But we don't think this is a very likely explanation. One of the reasons is, of course, that the distribution of BSAT and the conservative B perfect that we do find in present-day varieties basically show no geographical overlap. That is to say, BSAT is almost completely absent from regions where the B perfect still remains, while it is otherwise quite widespread throughout most of England and basically nowhere else. So we find that the ubiquity of BSAT within England, along with its absence outside of England, are together really hard to reconcile with this kind of conservative account. And especially so given that we can find lots of other evidence of similar founder effects for morphosyntactic features originating in different parts of England and turning up in parts of North America and other places. So it's really surprising that we wouldn't find this anywhere else in England if this were a very old feature. So we think it's more likely a recent innovation. And we think of this for a number of reasons. Well, one is that we find no evidence from early dialect descriptions or grammars citing this feature. We can't really find much evidence of actual historical data, aside from the few tokens that we mentioned, and a few other tokens, which I won't have time to go through. So we don't really have a lot of good historical evidence for it. And again, the absence of this sort of founder effect in North America, with one key exception that I'll mention in a minute, suggests that this feature emerged fairly late, well after the main periods of English settlement in North America and in other parts of the world. And so we think that this emerged sometime maybe in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Lastly, there's also, we think, a really plausible explanation for the rise and spread of this variant in the north of England at that particular time. That is to say, we think there's actually a compelling explanation or account of the so-called actuation problem, right? We can explain why it rose at that point, at that time. So just to sort of really quickly go over the historical data or lack thereof, we've tried to find examples of this data. We searched a number of historical corpora without much success. Most of these counts, again, are approximate. We haven't weeded them out. Most of them are probably false positives, especially from the corpus of historical American English. But by and large, we really can't find any good evidence for the presence of B stud that antedate the 20th century, which is a bit frustrating. But it suggests that it maybe is not as old as we might think it is. But there's the one intriguing place where we do find this feature outside of England is in Newfoundland. And we know that Newfoundland has a number of conservative vernaculars that have preserved a lot of features that were brought by settlers from different parts of England and Ireland and Scotland. And in fact, BSAT is well attested in certain parts of Newfoundland, especially parts of Newfoundland that were settled from the southwest of England in the early 1800s. So exactly from part of England where we find this variant is one of the parts that is most prevalent today. So here are some examples that Sandra Clark was generous enough to provide. From an older speaker, we can find further examples from the St. John's Telegram, the major newspaper in Newfoundland, from much more recent, from the early 2000s. So these are all taken from the past 20 years. These are clear examples of the BSAT variant, suggesting that this is quite prevalent in Newfoundland even today. So this Newfoundland connection is really quite intriguing. It suggests again that if this form arose in the late 1700s in the north and in the southwest of England, it was brought by settlers from the southwest in particular to Newfoundland and had established itself and has continued on. So we have what looked like a clear founder effect in Newfoundland that we can trace back to a particular time and place. So finally, the remaining question is, well, why the North in the 19th century? Well, there's a really, really sort of neat hypothesis that was put forth by Grafmiller in some early work in 1999 and afterward, which he argues that what happened was a kind of hypercorrection of an older past participle form, sitten. So the form sitten is a much older form of the past participle of the verb sit that was prevalent in many parts of England. But as the country began rapidly sort of standardizing in the 18th and 19th centuries through the rise of dictionaries and grammar books and education, formal education, and so on, the Southern Standard form sat began to replace sitten. And as the Standard English sat increasingly replaced sitten in the 16, 17, and into the 1800s, this is gradually pushed out that form in many parts of England, but we have evidence that sitten, the past participle form sitten, persisted in the north of England, at least well into the 19th century. So it was still kicking around right around the time we think BSAT might have begun developing. And so the hypothesis is that perhaps northern speakers sort of overextended the use of sat, this incoming standard form sat, to progressive contexts where it was homophonous with the existing progressive form sitten, right? The alveolar variant of the present progressive form, right? So sitten and sitten are homophonous, and so it seems very likely that speakers might have hyperextended the past participle form sat to this progressive context as well as the perfective context. And later on, this was extended by analogy to stood as well, right? And so we see that again in a lower proportion of stood versus BSAT. So we think this is a really intriguing and compelling explanation for why BSAT would have emerged in the north of England in around the late 18th, early 19th century. And so this seems, and there's further evidence for the influence of Standard English sort of resulting in the rise of a widespread non-standard feature in other contexts. So this work by Seppinen looking at the use of possessive relatives, non-standard possessive relatives constructions that arose perhaps as an influence from the standard. We also think that there could be motivations for why this would, once it became established through hypercorrection, would continue to develop. And not only does it serve as a kind of formality marker, which has its own sort of functional uses, but it also could perhaps work as a way of easing certain kinds of processing demands. And this goes back to the idea of the so-called horror equi principle proposed by Gunther Rodenberg, which is basically the idea that people trying to avoid repetitions of similar or near identical elements. And there is some research suggesting that this may play a role in speakers' choices between sat versus sitting and stood versus standing. Right. So the idea is that the presence of a post-modifying ing form, like I was sat watching television, the presence of that post-modifying ing form might influence the use of sat as a way of avoiding that repetition. I was sitting watching TV versus I sat watching TV. Right? And so we looked into our data to code for this, and we coded for the presence of a post-modifying ing form following the main verb sat or sit or stand within a forward window. And the expectation was that sat or stood should be more likely the closer that post-modifying ing verb is to the main verb. So if we consider examples like this, we should expect that in the bottom case, stood would be most likely, whereas in the top case, sat or stood would be the least likely, since the ing forms would be quite distant from one another. And when we look in the data from GLOBE, which is probably the best corpus, the largest part of speech tagged corpus data set we had, we see a very clear picture where what looks like a horror equi effect, where speakers tend to prefer the past participle form when it's immediately followed by a present participle. And we tested this in our regression model, and it was clearly significant for both sat and stand, sit and stand. So we find a clear preference for the past participle form when it's followed immediately by a present participle, suggesting that speakers are using this as a way of avoiding this sort of awkward repetition of identical forms. So, to conclude, we have an incredibly large data set of well over 100,000 tokens, which shows clear regional signals, namely that BSAT is widespread in England, particularly in the north and the southwest. We find that with the exception of that one part of the world in Newfoundland, BSAT and so is wholly absent outside England and Wales. We find there's very little historical evidence to support the hypotheses that BSAT stood as a conservative retention, and we think that the geographical distribution and the lack of historical evidence suggest that BSAT is a much more recent innovation. Finally, we think that there is a plausible sociolinguistic account in the form of a hypercorrection for the actuation of this change at a particular time and place. And so we think this is actually a curious case of an incoming change from above, sort of paradoxically leading to the rise of a new non-standard variant from below. So we have changes from above leading to changes from below. Looking ahead, there are still a number of questions that we haven't fully addressed. First of all, it's not really clear why or how BSAT should have become so prominent in the Southwest and not the Midlands as well, right? Why did it sort of skip over the Midlands from the north to the Southwest? Did it spread from one place to the other? We don't really have a good account of that. We do know that areas in the Southwest, and particularly Bristol, grew quite dramatically in the early 1800s, but we don't yet have evidence from large-scale migration patterns or any kind of other social historical data to connect the north and the southwest of England conclusively. Finally, it's also not clear what factors, sort of, if any, condition the sort of present-day variation that we find between sat and stood, or sitting and standing. So we have a little bit of a picture. We're starting to form a picture of that latter question, but there's still a lot to be done. So we think that there are likely subtle semantic distinctions at play. So, for example, differences in animacy or difference in the narrativity of the context, or perhaps differences in the permanence of the state being expressed by the construction are all possible explanations, but these require a lot more careful annotation and exploration, which we haven't had time to do yet. We also still lack sufficient data to test social factors, particularly sex, age, education, or any other kind of sort of fine-grained aspects of identity or regional identity. But we hope that understanding how these different factors could shape variation today might help us clarify some of the hypotheses regarding the origins of BSAT and perhaps its spread into different regions. If we could have a better picture of the sort of grammar that underlies the variation between sat and sitting, that might help shed light on the regional and historical patterns that we find. Okay, thank you.